All right, we'll give it a minute or so for other people to file in through the Zoom or YouTube link. For those of you that are reading along, in your own copy will be on Shemot, that is Exodus chapter 29. And we'll be beginning at verse 38. Makes it a little bit easier to read. Of course, nothing beats an actual book, but if you're trying to do a one-screen version rather than having a book and the screen for conversation, although really if you have your own book, until later on today, you wouldn't actually need. A reminder that there is a link through my YouTube channel to the file, the folder that contains all of the PDFs that I use for class. So you can also download and even print those out if you are a big fan of paper, or put them on any other device if it's an easier method for study. All right, and with that public service announcement, why don't we go ahead and get to work? It's a slightly longer passage that we're going to be dealing with today. Well, a slightly longer set of commentary that we'll be dealing with today because we're going to have to bring in a lot of outside information. Because we are looking at the Mishkan, or alternatively the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, the center place and centerpiece of our camp during not only the wandering in the desert, which wasn't wandering, we knew where we were going, but also became the centerpiece of religious activity and life all the way up until the establishment of the stone temple of Jerusalem by Solomon. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, the structure that we are going to be talking about today was absolutely essential and pivotal in the life of Israel. So it shouldn't surprise us too much that we cover it so much, and yet people still want to skip these sections. Once again, I'm continuing my lifelong quest to try and convince people that skipping this section is not a good idea. And I hope that I'll be bringing something that perhaps you haven't seen before, or if you have, maybe you haven't thought of it in this way, and that will make it especially worthwhile. So let's go ahead and pick up with our Torah text, beginning with chapter 29 from the book of Exodus, Shemot, verse 38. Now, this is what you shall offer upon the altar: 2 yearling lambs each day regularly. You shall offer 1 lamb in the morning, and you shall offer the other lamb at twilight. There shall be 1/10 of a measure of choice flour with 1/4 of a hin of beaten oil mixed in, and a libation of 1/4 hin of wine for 1 lamb. And you shall offer the other lamb at twilight, repeating it with the meal offering of the morning with its libation, an offering by fire for a pleasing odor to Adonai. A regular burnt offering throughout the generations at the entrance of the tent of meeting before Adonai. For there I will meet with you, and there I will speak with you, and there I will meet with the Israelites, and it shall be sanctified by my presence. All right, so we're just going to pause there for just a second to try and understand what we're talking about. The first part probably seems fairly obvious, which is the special form of sacrifices that are going to take place every morning and every evening, and the things that need to be offered with them. Now, we get a recap of this throughout the rest of the Torah as well, but here we see this as being a critical component, that the creation of the Mishkan is a location where sacrifices are going to be offered on behalf of the entire community. The second half, however, which flows at the end of verse 42, can be, well, a little odd. It seems to jump. We're talking at the beginning, just like we've mentioned, about this olat tamid, these regular or perpetual offerings for all of your generations at the entrance to this Ohel Moed, this tent of meeting. And then we jump to this clause, which you'll notice that the English translator had to put a period into because it felt too abrupt. But really, it is just a clause that God is going to be meeting with us in that place, and that God will be speaking at that place. Now, I'm going to point out just for the moment, although our commentators will go a little bit more into this, that the you and the you are not the same you. That is to say, the you of I will meet with you and the you of I will speak with you are not the same Hebrew word. This is the problem between Hebrew and English, because in Hebrew we have a word for lachem, to use, plural, to all y'all, if you will, in the more southern version. And then we have elecha, which is to you, one person only. So in English, we use the word you as both a singular and a plural. In Hebrew, there are two different variations of that word. And we are getting the plural version first. I will meet with you, plural, and I will speak with you, singular, for the second one. That will come back to a little bit of significance later on. Just want to make sure. But we are having this meeting, and there is this meeting with the children of Israel, and this is going to find the Mishkan as sanctified with God's glory, with God's might, with God's presence. There are many different ways to translate the word kavod. And then it goes on to wrap it up. I will sanctify the tent of meeting and the altar, and I will consecrate Aaron and his sons to serve me as priests. Again, although the sanctification of the space is being done through the inauguration and its construction, there is a reciprocal sanctification of dedication and appointment of this place as indeed being holy, and of Aaron and his sons as being the Kohanim. Nevertheless, despite that particularity for Aaron and his family, I will abide among the Israelites, and I will be their God. And they shall know that I, Adonai, am their God, who brought them out from the land of Egypt, that I might abide among them, I, their God, Adonai. We finish off with this rather familiar phrase of explanation that this activity will make known to them that God is their God, and a reminder that this is the God who brought them out of the land of Egypt. Now, why would the Mishkan in particular be a reminder not only that God is our God, but that this is the God who brought us out of the land of Egypt? Indeed, what in the world is this Mishkan doing at all? Certainly, we could continue the practice of building a mizbeach, an altar, whenever we walked around, the same way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did, and just offer a sacrifice wherever we happen to be. We've already seen a sacrifice offered by Moses in this way. There's no reason to continue this, or rather to discontinue that practice and create this formalized and elaborated building structure and its utensils for sacrifices. It's not like we couldn't have offered them before. God seems to be implying that the Mishkan is serving a very important function, and in a function that goes beyond simply being able to have a sacrificial relationship with God. That is something that predates the Mishkan. It's something that will, depending upon the different time frame, continue even with the Mishkan's existence. But it seems that the Mishkan is serving a different symbolic and important role in the community and in the theology of the community, especially as verse 46 is really highlighting that this is all culminating in some deep message about our understanding of God and our history. That's the mystery that we are going to try and unravel today, is what was the Mishkan doing more than just making a pretty building where we could do sacrifices? Everyone on the same page then? All right, so let's see what our commentary wants to say about this. Oh, come on, up to the top. There we are. So first, we're going to start off with just a little bit of Hebrew lesson. This is coming from Ibn Ezra. I will meet, Ivaed, right? This is the word that's used when God says, I will meet with you. And the Torah, as he says, Torah clearly explains the reason that the tabernacle is called the Ohel Moed, right? This is the tent of meeting. That word Moed and Ivaed, those come from the same Hebrew roots. And as is very common when giving a name to a human being, oftentimes the verb will be brought in a different construction, different grammatical form in that same sentence. And Ibn Ezra is saying, look, God is doing that for us right here too. It's called the Ohel Moed because Ivaed, I will meet you there. So Moed is indeed from the same root as the word for meeting. Great. We are meeting with God. Who's meeting with God? Right? This is our conference room. Whose conference room? Again, Ibn Ezra helps us understand that grammar issue that I mentioned earlier with you, meaning Israel, all of you, that the tent of meeting is a meeting place for all of us. Now, what might we have thought alternatively? Well, we might have thought from the second half to speak there to you, which is a singular form of the word, that was meant to speak to Moses alone. But what we are finding is that, yes, God will be communicating to Moses alone, with Moses having the greatest share of prophecy of anyone ever, but that Israel as a whole, as a plural group, we will also be meeting God at that place. All right, so Moses gets a private conference, but all of us are considered to be meeting God at this place. But why? Why would this place seem to be a meeting? Why would God need that? Well, Rashi gives us an explanation, and I will be met there. I will come together with them in conversation as a king who appoints a place of meeting where he will speak with his subjects. So even though we know from the grammar, as Ibn Ezra just explained, that God is only going to be audible in the spiritual sense directly to Moses, nevertheless, Rashi is helping us understand that the building of this pavilion is very much in keeping with what kings would do at any point in history, which is to say they establish an actual place so that people know this is the place they come when they wish to speak with the king. And more precisely, as he is formulating it, this is a reminder that the king wishes to speak to the subjects, that it's not just where can the king hear them, but a reminder that the king wants them to hear him. With, of course, the reminder here being that the king is promulgating the rules, the laws, the teachings for the good of the society, at least if you're lucky enough to have a good king. And certainly God is a good one. But Rashi is saying that just like in his own experience of medieval Europe, where a king would set up a residence no matter where he traveled in order that the subjects would know this is where the king is speaking from and this is where you would address your questions, so too God is making this place. So it's not just about building an altar. It's not just about sacrifices. It's not just about killing a bunch of animals and burning up a bunch of fat, blood, and grain. This is a symbol of the meeting place, the linkage between us and God in the relationship that we have. Indeed, Rashi goes on to explain precisely where that meeting will take place. Some of our rabbis say that it is from above the copper altar that the Holy One spoke with Moses, for this was at the entrance, the copper altar being closest to the entrance place of the temple itself, or sorry, the Mishkan itself. But some say that he spoke from above the cover of the ark, as it is said, Exodus 25, and I will speak to you from above the cover. And where I shall be met by you are not used in reference to the altar at the entrance, meaning our verse here, but rather in reference to the tent of meeting itself. So Rashi is trying to clarify that this verse says, I will meet you there. Well, where is the there that we are being met? We know it's not a particular set of GPS coordinates because the Mishkan will move around. So where within the Mishkan itself, wherever it is constructed, will God be met? You might think that it would be at the entrance, at the closest place that a person could meet, because he says, I will meet you there, and there will usually mean a closest location. However, others argue that since it mentions the Ark in particular, and this is the Ark from Raiders of the Lost Ark fame, always funny to me that the Ark is more famous because of that movie than it is for the Torah, that specifically it talks about speaking from the cover, and therefore it must mean that we will be met not there, because the average person, of course, can't come there. The average person cannot walk into the inner chamber of the Mishkan, of the Tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, but instead meeting you there must be referring to the entirety of the tabernacle construction, that God is going to meet us, remember the plural, the people, through the temple itself, that this will be a symbol of that meeting between us and God. Now, Ramban Nachmanides has a few things to say about that in his own inimitable style. Rashi says that this means on the condition that I dwell in the midst of them, going from our verses, but the usage of the word, of the letter lamed for a conditional does not exist, right? Ramban is no stranger to pointing out when he thinks someone else has made a mistake. And he's saying that to say that this is on the condition that I dwell in the midst of them, implying that somehow there is a conditional relationship of whether or not God will be in the tabernacle or not, simply is not supported by the grammar. But Rabbi Ibn Ezra, who he often attacks, here he supports, explained, the purpose of my bringing them forth from the land of Egypt was only that I might dwell in their midst, and that this was the fulfillment of you shall serve God upon this mountain, which was the initial command to Moses when he met God at the burning bush. So what Ibn Ezra is saying, and Ramban is agreeing with, is the idea that our final verse, let's just jump back so we can remind ourselves of it, that this final verse that says that I am the God that brought them out of the land of Egypt, in order that I will dwell among them, was not if I will dwell among them. It wasn't a conditional, but was an, in fact, purpose. Now, that is similar to the translation that we have here. But Rashi was arguing that it should be read not as the purpose, but as a conditional. Now, what difference does it make apart from grammar nerds? Well, Ramban explains. He explained it well, and if it is so, meaning the way that Rabbi Ibn Ezra said, that it was the purpose itself was in order that God could dwell in our midst, there is in this matter a great secret. What is it that makes us scratch our heads? In the plain sense of things, it would appear that the dwelling of the divine glory in Israel was to fulfill a want below, meaning that God was doing this for our benefit, for our sake, that God came and made himself palpable through the construction of the Mishkan as a kindness, a service, a benefit to us. But it is not so. It fulfilled a want above, being rather similar in thought to that which Scripture states, Israel in whom I will be glorified, taken from Isaiah 49:3, and many other quotes that are of similar type that are found in the rest of Ramban's citation. Now, what difference does that make? Why is this mind-blowing? Why is this a hidden secret kind of concept? Well, what Ramban is hinting at here, and he does often only hint at things, is the rather shocking idea that God did not build the Mishkan for our benefit, or at least not for our benefit alone, but that God brought us out of Egypt, gave us the instructions, gave us the blueprints for building the Mishkan, because it served a need for God, rather than serving a need for us, at least not only for us. And the idea that there would be a need for God, and then that there would be something God would need us to do to fulfill some lack for God, that can sound quite heretical. God is, after all, God. What is there that we can do? What is there we can offer? What is there we can construct that is in any way, shape, or form going to fill a gap in God's life that God could not fill, well, simply by being God and not having any wants, needs, or lack? I mean, that is what it is to be infinitely perfect. Yet, we can see from the quotes that Ramban brings, and the Isaiah one is typical, that the need that is being filled here is that God may be God, but that doesn't mean God is known as God by the rest of the world without something actually happening in the world through which that can be proclaimed and that can be made clear, obvious, and beyond doubt. That, yes, God is God and perfect and not lacking in any way, shape, or form, but that doesn't mean that the world recognizes God as it should. And that means God sometimes needs, well, to be glorified through something that will be contingent upon something else. That doesn't make God less perfect. It just means the world is an imperfect vehicle for expressing God's glory without human participation. And that is a little controversial. And I've had people in the past, when I've tried to introduce this concept, get a little bit huffy about that, that somehow this is implying that God is less of God if we're not proclaiming God as such. But I just want to make sure we can deal with that right now, or at least I'll try. This isn't talking about reducing God's sovereignty, God's majesty, God's greatness, God's infinite perfection. This is talking about that in order to be properly recognized by the world, which is God's ultimate goal, so that through recognition of God, the world will come to be perfected. In order for that to take place, God needs people to do it willingly. If God wanted us to be automatons, God would have made us robots in the beginning. In order for it to be done willingly, God needs someone to actually choose to pick up the banner, to pick up the flag and say, yes, there is God. This is what God does. And this is why God is amazing. Follow me. And the Mishkan, in this particular instance, is the example of that God needs to have publicity. And the only way to get publicity is to have people actually publicize what God is doing. So hopefully that idea is clear, because if it's not clear, the coming comparison is going to seem very unclear to you. All right, so with that in mind, we are now going to take a lengthy section of texts that are brought from a relatively new book, and one that I am enjoying thoroughly as I read through it. It's called Ani Ma'amin. It's put out by Rabbi Joshua Berman, and it is a traditionalist look at the historical, historicity, the historical truth, and that's a very tricky word, of the text of the Bible. And in particular, we're looking at his chapter analyzing the Exodus. Did we actually come out of the land of Egypt as described in any way, shape, or form by the book of Exodus? And one of the things that he wants us to consider is the Mishkan itself, this tabernacle, this tent, this seeming afterthought to the whole story of the Exodus that makes up the conclusion of the book of Exodus, but doesn't really seem to have any connection. Even though we just saw one of the main verses describe it as being an essential part of establishing our understanding of God's bringing us to the Exodus. So we're going to use a lot of his text and a number of pictures, yay, multimedia, to try and understand what this might mean. And the first thing we have to understand about whether or not the Exodus actually took place is whether or not it feels like it comes from the right time period from Egyptian history. That is to say, do the Torah texts seem to have anything that would be considered contemporaneous with the time period in Egyptian history that they're talking about? And indeed, they do. As an example, he argues, consider the familiar biblical refrain that God took Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. No more famous phrase than that. The Tanakh could have employed the phrase to describe a whole host of divine acts on Israel's behalf, meaning in other parts of the Bible, you would expect God to always have a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And yet, the phrase is used only with reference to the Exodus. God doesn't have a mighty hand and an outstretched arm for David. God doesn't have a mighty hand and outstretched arm for Solomon or for anyone else. He argues this is no accident. In much of Egyptian royal literature, the phrase mighty hand is a synonym for the pharaoh. And many of the pharaoh's actions are said to be performed through his mighty hand or his outstretched arm. Nowhere else in the ancient Near East are rulers described in this way, meaning this is a uniquely Egyptian idiom to describe the power of Pharaoh. What is more, the term is most frequently found in Egyptian royal propaganda during the latter part of the second millennium, which indeed is when most people believe that the Exodus would have taken place. So we find in our usage of mighty hand and outstretched arm, a linguistic parallel, an idiom perhaps borrowed from Egyptian thinking and Egyptian expression from that same time period, uniquely throughout biblical literature being applied to the event that would have taken place from that particular time in Egyptian history. That's some interesting coincidence, you might be thinking, that this might overlap. However, as he's going to point out, it's not merely a coincidence that the language that is being used here seems to be drawing a parallel between God and Pharaoh. That is not happenstance. Instead, he draws our attention to a very important battle. Ramses' paramount achievement, this is Pharaoh Ramses, which occurred early in his reign, was his 1274 BCE victory over Egyptians' arch-rival, the Hittite Empire, at the Battle of Kadesh, a town located on the Orontes rivers on the modern-day border between Lebanon and Syria. Upon his return to Egypt, Ramses inscribed accounts of this battle on monuments all across the empire. 10 copies of this inscription exist to this day. These multiple copies make the Battle of Kadesh the most publicized event anywhere in the ancient world, the events of Greece and Rome not accepted, meaning as far as actual archaeological evidence of a particular event, the multiple copies of this same construction, the same sculpture, gives the most evidence of this particular activity. Moreover, the texts were accompanied by a new creation, bas-reliefs depicting the battle, frame by frame, so that much as with stained glass windows in medieval churches, viewers illiterate in hieroglyphics could learn about the pharaoh's exploits. And we have a helpful sketch drawing of it because the actual relief is not terribly clear. And so you can see the legions of Pharaoh riding forth, and obviously all the hieroglyphics explaining everything that's going on, and the imagery of the sieges, the attacks, the battles, the people dying, and all of that. This is an early attempt at a documentary, propaganda-wise, because of course it's being written by Pharaoh for his victory over the Hittites. And as we're going to see, this bas-relief is very helpful in understanding the Mishkan itself. As he explains, scholars had long searched for a model, a precursor that could have inspired the design of the tabernacle that served as the cultic center of the encampment of the children of Israel in the wilderness, a design laid out in exquisite verbal detail in Exodus 25 to 29, which is what we're reading now. Although the remains of Phoenician temples reveal a plan remarkably like that of Solomon's temple, built as it happens with the extensive assistance of a Phoenician king, which is something that has been known for a very long time, that the temple itself, the floor plan of the temple is absolutely a parallel of Phoenician temple design, that it was not a uniquely imagined architecture, but was borrowing from the structural architectural norms of the region, and especially of Phoenicia, which we know was supplying a lot of the raw materials for the temple. Unlike that, where we know other cultural varieties that are very similar to our temple, we don't have anything, right? No known cultic site from the ancient Near East seemed to resemble the desert tabernacle. We don't have any examples of what it looks like. If you look at the picture behind me on the background, if we look at Egyptian temples, the Mishkan does not follow their pattern, nor does the Temple of Solomon. When we look at other cultic sites and temples throughout the Near East, nothing has the pattern, the structure, the style of the Mishkan. The idea of the long rectangular structure in the middle with a reserved back portion surrounded by a larger enclosure is just not found. It does not seem to have any precedence. Then, some 80 years ago, an unexpected affinity was noticed between the biblical descriptions of the tabernacle and the illustration of Ramses' camp at Kadesh in several bas-reliefs. And what is that similarity? In the throne tent, displayed in tighter focus on the next page, the emblem bearing the pharaoh's name and symbolizing his power is flanked by falcons symbolizing the god Horus, with their wings spread in protection over him. In Exodus, the ark of the tabernacle is similarly flanked by two winged cherubim, whose wings hover protectively over it. To complete the parallel, Egypt's 4 army divisions at Kadesh would have camped on the 4 sides of Ramses' battle compound. The book of Numbers states that the tribes of Israel camped on the 4 sides of the tabernacle compound. The resemblance of the military camp at Kadesh to the tabernacle goes beyond architecture. It is conceptual as well. For Egyptians, Ramses was both a military leader and a divinity. In the Torah, God is likewise a divinity, obviously, but also Israel's leader in battle. For example, see Numbers 10. The tent of God, the divine warrior, parallels the tent of Pharaoh, the living Egyptian god, poised for battle. So you can see an illustrative version of this connection here. You can see that in the bas-relief, and I'll go back up to show you the picture a little bit more closely in a second, that we have a surrounding perimeter, a curtain wall, if you will, surrounding Pharaoh's portable battle tent. And then there was an entrance that would lead to a reception tent. And behind that was Pharaoh's own private chamber. And we'll get back to that imagery of what was in that chamber in just a second, because that is rather critical. And you'll notice that the proportions that are seen between the bas-relief and the Mishkan are identical, having a 2-to-1 ratio and a 1-by-1 in terms of measurements. Rear chamber is identical, having a perimeter wall around, having the entrance on the same side, lined up in the same way to the east. Egyptian maps apparently had north to the south. Having north at the top is a more modern convention. If we go back and look at the sketch of the bas-relief, we can now see more clearly what he is talking about having the outer walls, the outer curtains that would have been around the whole area, a long entrance that people would have come down to then come into the reception tent to pay homage to the pharaoh that was found in the back. And like he said, the different Egyptian symbols are surrounding the seal of the pharaoh himself. So that is symbolic. Now, with all of that in mind, he goes on to tell us, in their thinking, the Israelites reworked the throne tent ideology, with God displacing Ramses the Great as the most powerful force of the time. For the Torah, of course, cannot be represented in image and requires no protection, and pagan deities have no standing, which is why, instead of falcons and Horus, we have cherubim hovering protectively over the ark, bearing the tablets of his covenant with Israel. And if we look a little bit more closely at the original bas-relief, you can see more clearly what it actually looks like in the stonework. And then again, a close-up of what this tent structure would have looked like, with Pharaoh being flanked by the falcon gods. And if that bears any resemblance to what we see in Raiders of the Lost Ark, or to other depictions of what the Aron HaKodesh would have looked like, indeed, that is precisely what he is trying to tell us, that the Ark of the Covenant served a similar role to the centerpiece falcons that were hovering over Pharaoh, and it was deliberate that in either this more Egyptian-influenced depiction or the depiction from Hollywood, that in the middle, which is precisely as Rashi mentioned, where we would be hearing from God, there would be nothing, is a very deliberate replacement, that it is taking the symbology, the imagery, the iconography, the cultural motifs of Egypt and of a particular time in Egypt, and flipping them into making a powerful statement about God and about our exodus from Egypt. That this is not just borrowing, this is borrowing, adapting, and using to say something explicit that would have been understood by the people at that time, by the people that were living at the time when this symbol was all over the place, and these propaganda bas-reliefs that were littering the countryside that our people would have been exposed to. That we would have seen how Ramses proclaimed himself this god king and bragged about his greatest accomplishment in battle and said, do you know how we could really put a finger in his eye? When we leave, we can build our place of meeting in a way that will mimic his place of meeting, but we will subvert the message that he was trying to build into it, into a message that is much more appropriate to what we are proclaiming about our God and our liberation. Let me just scroll down. Sorry for the long scrolls. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's interesting, to imagine that this might be connected, but perhaps the similarity between the tents is either coincidental, or perhaps the similarity between the structures was just that's what people were doing at the time. It was a common structure. And of course, we don't have many examples of them because wood and cloth would disintegrate over the years, and it wouldn't leave any obvious foundation. Maybe every king went out in that kind of battle array and used that kind of form. Now, that is entirely possible. That doesn't diminish the importance of using it as a reference, although we don't see it depicted in that way in other locations. However, on that same bas-relief, in the poetry of the Egyptians, we find in the actual words used to describe the attack, the battle, and what we are meant to make of it, a great many similarities to the same poem that is used to describe our Exodus. That is to say, Shirat Hayam, the poem that describes our Exodus from Egypt and the parting and collapsing of the sea, the poem in which we find the most famous lines that are most familiar, Micha mocha ba'elim Adonai, who is like you among the mighty, or among those that call themselves God, Adonai. And the parallels are striking. I've only brought a couple examples because there are many, many pages in the book, and I'm not going to read the whole book to you. I highly recommend that you get a copy yourself. But these examples hopefully will suffice and whet your appetite. In each text, meaning both the text of the Egyptians and our text from Torah, the enemy then gives voice to the futility of fighting against a divine force and seeks to escape. In each statement, statements made earlier about the potency of the divine figure are now confirmed by the enemy himself. In the Kadesh poem, that's the Egyptian version, the Hittites retreat from Ramses. One of them called out to his fellows, "Look out, beware, don't approach him. See, Sekhmet the mighty is she who is with him." Right? That they are saying that one of the Egyptian gods is helping the pharaoh, referring to a goddess extolled earlier in the poem. In this passage, the Hittites acknowledge that they are fighting not only a divine force, but a very particular divine force. We find the same trope in the Exodus narrative. Confounded God in 1425, the Egyptians say, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." An element common to both compositions is the submergence of the enemy in water. The Kadesh poem does not assign the same degree of centrality to the event as does Exodus. It does not tell of the windswept seas overpowering the Hittites, for example, but Ramses does indeed vauntingly proclaim that in their haste to escape his onslaught, the Hittites sought refuge by plunging into the river, whereupon he slaughtered them in the water. The reliefs depict the drowning of the Hittites in vivid fashion. And if you are downloaded the PDF, you can scroll back up and look at the rather graphic way that they are depicted being overcome by the water and the advancing Egyptians. So we can see that in many ways, and again, this is a much longer discussion in his book, the language of the Kadesh poem was echoed by the language of Shirat Hayam, the song that was sung when we left Egypt. He goes on just a little bit more for our purposes today. In both the poem and in Exodus, the poem and in Exodus, praise of the victorious sovereign continues in a double strophe extolling his powerful hand or arm. The poem, "You are the son of Amun achieving with his arms, you devastate the lands of Hatti by your valiant arm." Whereas in the song, meaning in Exodus, "Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, your right hand, O Lord, shatters the foe." That is very powerfully reworking the language that would have been familiar to everyone in Egypt, and indeed in many parts of the ancient world around Egypt, and taking out Ramses, taking out the Egyptian divinity, modifying it to fit our own personal circumstance, and then throwing it back in their face. In a way, the language shift and the building of the Mishkan almost make a satire, a parody of what the Egyptians were bragging about in their own propaganda, in a way by deliberately reusing and refashioning the language of Egyptian triumph to explain our triumph. We are trying to say, who is truly greater, Ramses and his battle against the Hittites, or God, who was able to take a virtually defenseless people and lead them out of right from underneath the Pharaoh's nose? Truly, it is God that is greater, and truly it is God who dwells among his people. And that last part, of course, provides a very important shift. The Mishkan was not designed in order to prove just to us that God was still available. It was not just a place where the Kohanim could go and have sacrifices. It was not just a place where Moses would hear God's voice. But most importantly, it was a place that would show the average Jew, the average Israelite, that unlike the hierarchical structure of the ancient Pharaoh world, where Pharaoh was at the top and the peasants were so far below that they would never even encounter Pharaoh, in our structure, we all surrounded that tent. We all met God at that place. God was the ruler for all of us directly, intimately, personally, rather than in this abstracted hierarchical, dare I say, pyramid structure that we would have been leaving behind as we left Egypt. And that, again, subversion of Egyptian culture, and by using their own language, making it familiar and yet different in ways that would be explicitly understood by the average Israelite who had grown up with this idea, is a very, very powerful reshaping and manipulation of the culture that they would have been living in and leaving in order to lead them in the right direction. And what does this mean with regards to the Exodus itself? Well, again, continuing from the book Anima Amin, in my view, the evidence suggests that the Exodus text preserves the memory of a moment when the earliest Israelites reached for language with which to extol the mighty virtues of God and found the raw materials in the terms and tropes of an Egyptian text, well known to them. In appropriating and transvaluing that material, the Torah puts forward the claim that God has far outdone the greatest achievement of the greatest earthly potentate. That by using this particular construct, by framing it in this way, in a way that would have been understood to the average person who had lived in Egypt and was leaving, God was making a very powerful statement to them. This does not diminish the beauty and greatness of neither the song itself nor of the construction of the Mishkan, but it makes it much more understandable of why it would be exactly as they are, because it would have been reaching to that particular generation and of saying to them, here is a song that you have heard over and over again about the greatness of Pharaoh, but what is greater than Pharaoh? God. And we are going to make sure that we repurpose this in a way that you will immediately get that message. God could not start from scratch with the Israelites. God had to work with them as they were. And by repurposing the cultural symbols of the country they were leaving, this was able to be achieved in an incredibly powerful way. Unfortunately, 3,000-ish years later, it's harder for us to see the parallels. The culture has moved on. We do not see in the structure an immediate parallel to Egyptian war compounds. We do not see in the language an immediate parallel to the language of domination from Egypt. But that would have been very obvious to our ancestors in the past. In the same way that sometimes parody or satire from the middle of the 20th century is lost on people in the 21st, because it has been just a few short decades since that was considered insightful or funny. So too, 3,000 years later, it's often hard for us to hear the underlying mockery of the Egyptian pride and arrogance. But I think this is an excellent explanation of why the song was written as it was and why the Mishkan was built as it was. And the lesson that comes out of it is that this was indeed much more than simply a place for offering sacrifices, and that this was making powerful claims and statements about our relationship with God. And those statements and truths are ones that we should still be holding on to. I'd like to, been at a long monologue there because of the way the text read. but I'll take a break here. And if people have questions or comments, please feel free to unmute or use the chat.
Rabbi, I'm also seeing how having the Mishkan modeled after Pharaoh's encampment also projects power for God. As the people travel and the other nations see the encampment, they will see something that looks like where their king lives. And so it begs the question, who is their king? Whose word do they obey? What do they do? And so that right there, it does.
Oh, I don't know if your connection fell or mine, but you seem to go paused. But let me go ahead and build off the way you were going, which is exactly right, that when others would have looked to this encampment, for example, when we see Bil'am looking out at the encampment, it would have been very reminiscent of the Egyptian war camps. And like you said, we would have appeared to have had our own seat of martial glory. But again, by subverting it, by making that chamber empty, by making that chamber not filled with a human that thought himself a god, but by a symbol that reminded us of God being our God and ultimate king, it was a great way of flipping the expectations of the ancient world right on its head. Noelle?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so you didn't specifically mention this, and I'm not sure if it's the right time to address it, but my children have a couple teachers at school that whenever Passover is coming up, they always take time to like get it in there and no, the Jews were not slaves in Egypt. Do you have a way that maybe you've used with your children or something like that to address them basically saying that the narrative is completely false?
So actually, again, Berman's book is very good for discussing this in much more detail. So some of the things that he brings out, which I must admit were a little surprising to hear from an Orthodox source, is the idea that much of the way the Torah describes many of these events is meant to be a poetic description. But the idea that there were no slaves in Egypt, that we never had that, is what's known as the minimalist position within academia. And it is a position that is unfortunately quite prejudiced. That is to say, as I've often mentioned and many other times, if someone were to dig up the Torah itself, if they had found it as a bas-relief, like they found the relief of Kadesh, yes, they might argue of whether everything happened in it exactly as depicted. But if they had dug it up, they would be willing to say something must have happened, or else why did they make this giant sculpture, right? Why have a huge bas-relief of the Battle of Kadesh if there wasn't something going on? Now, it may not have been as one-sided as Ramsey puts it. It may not have been, actual gods walking the ground and fighting for them, as he describes it. But something must have happened. But unfortunately, mostly because the inerrancy of a superficial literal reading of the Bible became the norm among many non-Jewish groups, unfortunately also among some Jewish groups, as a way to try and buttress the authority of the church and those who claim to speak for it, it became the counterculture's favorite thing to say it's all wrong. And for it to end up being it's all wrong, or everything is exactly as I think with my kindergartners reading exactly what happened. And what Berman does throughout the book, which I'm really grateful for it coming from an Orthodox source, because it makes it more acceptable than if it came from a conservative, unfortunately, which is a whole nother question, is that he points out that our tradition has not ever been slavishly attached to the notion that everything had to happen in some perfectly kindergarten reading of the superficial layer of the text. So I absolutely believe that there was an exodus. I absolutely do not believe there were 600,000 people of military age that were leaving. Yes, but I also don't believe the Torah wants me to believe that there were 600,000 people of military age leaving. I believe it wants me to see in that a symbol that would have been relevant to the culture that it was told to a few thousand years ago. How that number would have mattered, again, is a whole other chapter in Berman's book. So it is unfortunate that very educated people will reject out of hand the notion that there ever was anything like an Exodus, simply because they are rejecting out of hand their counter-political rivals that say it all happened the way I think it did. And unfortunately, us and our own religion gets squished in the middle. Now, on a more social level, I would wonder, whenever Christmas comes around and whenever Easter comes around,
are they saying, and Jesus wasn't born at that time because it's not possible?
or that there is no Santa Claus even?
Yeah.
I mean,
oh no, they tell you to stay quiet about that. I mean,
right. So that I find extremely problematic.
That's a good point.
That people are willing to try and use the moment in class to literally poo-poo one particular religion's beliefs, but not all the others that could equally be held up to criticism and analysis.
Yeah, did the mountains really go to Muhammad? Let's talk about that in class.
Right, or Buddha, or any of the Hindu texts, or anything. There is plenty that we could say does not hold up to superficial scrutiny. And that needs more understanding. And again, I mean, in elementary school, I don't see the point of debating the historical details of the Exodus with 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. It's something that in high school I could somewhat imagine the conversation about how do we read ancient texts, how were ancient texts written, what is the difference between the way they did what we would call history and what they thought they were doing as history. I think that is a valuable discussion to have, because we will read books that were written in the time of Alexander the Great, or books that were written in the time of the Romans, or even medieval books, long before history as a discipline became normal the way we expect it. And we do need to be armed with an understanding of how to read them more subtly than just, well, they said what they said, and if it's wrong, they're liars, and if it's right, then everything they said must be true the way I think it is. That maybe we need a little more nuance, but I can't imagine trying to get that point across to a bunch of elementary schoolers, especially with an offhand remark at the expense of one person's religion.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it made the teacher feel very powerful, and I'm sure they felt they could get that dig in on religion targeted at the Jews in a way that they were afraid to do if it was targeted at anyone else.
Well, they would get much more backlash if they were to.
And that's why they kept their mouths shut when it came time to other faiths.
Yeah.
But we are a convenient target, even still, and unfortunately by people of all persuasions. So yes, that is disappointing to hear. And if you ever have that issue renewed, please let me know. I would be more than happy to set up a time when I can go in and talk to the teacher and or principal.
Oh, okay, thanks.
And I can explain to them both how their archaeology is shoddy and how their teaching is completely inappropriate. Because anyone who thinks they can say absolutely, definitively, that there was no Exodus doesn't understand how archaeology works. And anyone who thinks that the Exodus happened exactly identically as their kindergartner teacher told them it happened also doesn't understand the Exodus or history. And in Judaism in particular, also doesn't even understand our tradition.
Okay.
All right, thank you for that. That was a very appropriate digression, not at all off topic, and I appreciate the chance to talk about that. As someone who grew up with a mother as the education director of the school I was at, often having to go in and talk to staff at public schools and to let them know that no, this was not going to be taught and not the way they were saying it. It is a very important facet of growing up Jewish in a non-Jewish majority country, and one that even now, 40 some years later, still needs a lot of work. All right, well, take care, everyone. Again, I highly recommend Rabbi Berman's book, and please support good scholarship of this kind, and I'll look forward to talking with you next time. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.